August 7th, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy burned with the glow of war. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the shattered French countryside when an ominous roar filled the sky. German panzer crews dug in along a road near Mortain, tilted their heads upward. What they saw was not elegant, not sleek like their own Messerschmitts. Instead, bulky silhouettes of American fighters, broad wings glinting in the fading light, lumbered in formation. The P-47 Thunderbolt. The Germans had laughed at it once, calling it a flying milk jug, too heavy, too clumsy to matter. Yet in that hour, as its engines thundered above and its wings dipped into attack, laughter turned to dread. For within seconds, the armored spearhead of Hitler's counterattack would be transformed into a graveyard of smoking metal. The first salvo came without warning. 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, tore open the air with a crackle like tearing canvas. Bullets stitched across the road, hammering into the lead Panzer IV, shattering optics, piercing hatches. Then came the shriek, high-pitched, terrifying, the sound of a diving thunderbolt releasing its deadly payload. Bombs fell with grim precision, erupting in fireballs that shook the earth. German infantry scrambled for cover, blinded by dust and deafened by concussive blasts. In the chaos, the hulking milk jugs did not withdraw. They circled, banking wide, climbing back into the clouds only to swoop again with merciless rhythm. Each pass was a sentence, each explosion a verdict. Within minutes, what had been an armored thrust intended to slice through Allied lines lay crippled, columns of black smoke curling skyward, visible for miles, a signal of failure to commanders still clinging to their radios. Inside the wreckage, panic spread. German officers had believed the day would be theirs. Their tanks were veterans of the Eastern Front, their soldiers hardened by years of war. Against infantry and armor alone, they might have broken through. But this battlefield had become something else entirely, an arena dominated not by steel rolling on the ground, but by steel descending from the heavens. The battlefield shifted. The Germans fought an enemy they could not touch, could barely see until it was too late. Their vaunted armor was nothing more than prey under the relentless wings of the Thunderbolt. The P-47 was not graceful. It was a brute. It dove like a falling hammer, its engines screaming, its fuselage rattling as it unleashed hellfire upon anything that moved below. In German war diaries, officers recorded their shock. They had mocked this plane, considered it inferior to the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the Focke-Wulf 190. Yet what mocked them now was not its shape, not its weight, but its purpose. The Thunderbolt did not come to duel fighters in the sky. It came to erase columns, to slaughter supply lines, to rip out the armored heart of the Wehrmacht's last desperate offensives in the West. At Mortain, German generals were watching a dream collapse. Operation Lüttich, Hitler's last gamble in Normandy, relied on armored shock to punch through the American front and reach Avranches, splitting the Allied armies. The panzers surged forward, disciplined and deadly. But the sound from above betrayed their doom. Thunderbolts, guided by forward observers, swarmed overhead in waves. Tank crews, confined within their steel beasts, could only brace as rockets screamed down and bombs shattered treads. Survivors stumbled out of flaming hulks, only to be cut down by strafing runs that seemed endless. German radio traffic degenerated into desperate cries, orders drowned by the roar of engines and the thunder of explosions. The attack faltered, not because of American tanks, but because the sky itself had turned hostile. Witnesses described the battlefield as apocalyptic. Flames spread from tank to tank, ammunition cooked off in deafening bursts, and the acrid stench of burning fuel and flesh blanketed the countryside. Soldiers who once mocked the flying jug now prayed to escape its wrath. The Thunderbolt's rugged frame allowed it to absorb ground fire that would have downed lighter planes. Crews returned again and again, unleashing devastation until the German advance was paralyzed. Mortain was no longer a battle. It was a massacre, and the massacre was carried out not by divisions of men, but by a squadron of machines once derided as ungainly. It is in moments like these that wars pivot. German strategy, so often reliant on armored thrusts, faltered in the face of relentless air power. The lesson was cruelly clear. No matter how strong the armor, no matter how disciplined the troops, if the sky belonged to the enemy, the ground would become a killing field. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a machine the Germans had mocked, became the executioner of their ambitions in Normandy. The forests and hedgerows echoed with the thunder of its guns, the crack of its rockets, and the cries of men who realized too late that arrogance had blinded them to the storm descending from above. The wreckage lay smouldering as night fell. Farmers returning to their fields found landscapes transformed into cemeteries of steel. Blackened shells of panthers and panzeraffies sat twisted and silent, their crews entombed inside. For German command, the defeat was a humiliation. For American troops on the ground, watching from foxholes and hedgerows, it was salvation. They would write later of the awe they felt, watching thunderbolts dive with wings alight in the evening sun, raining destruction with the fury of gods. Soldiers pinned down by machine gun nests cheered as the earth shook from P-47 strikes. Men who expected death were given another day to fight. They knew then that they were not alone. Above them, always above them, the jug flew, and so the myth was shattered. The P-47 was no joke. It was not a flying milk jug. It was thunder given form, and in that thunder, German dreams of victory in the West burned to ash. The battlefield of Mortain was not simply a defeat. It was a revelation, a terrifying glimpse of the future of warfare, skies that dictated the ground, and machines once ridiculed that proved, in the crucible of fire, to be unstoppable. The laughter of German generals had long since faded, replaced by silence, and the silence was broken only by the distant echo of engines fading into the night. Beaches of Normandy had been stormed just 2 months earlier, on June 6th, in the greatest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen. The Allies had secured a fragile foothold, but every mile of French countryside had to be purchased in blood. Hedge-lined fields became fortresses, villages became killing zones, and every hill commanded a field of fire. The Wehrmacht, though battered by years of attrition, was still dangerous. German soldiers fought with grim determination, their tanks and artillery exacting a steep toll on advancing Allied forces. And while Allied armies slowly pushed inland, Hitler was not yet ready to surrender the initiative. He believed his armor could still strike, still cut, still break the spine of this invasion before it fully matured. By August, the German High Command prepared a desperate counterstroke. Operation Lüttich. The plan was audacious, a concentrated thrust of 7 panzer divisions through the American lines near Mortain, westward to Avranches. If successful, this blow would sever the Allied armies, pinning British and Canadian forces in the north while throwing American divisions into chaos. It was the kind of maneuver that had defined Germany's early triumphs in 1940, the essence of blitzkrieg reborn. Fast-moving tanks, supported by mechanized infantry, would exploit surprise and momentum. Hitler himself demanded it, ignoring his generals' warnings that German armor was depleted, fuel reserves low, and the skies hostile. He was chasing shadows of past glories, blind to the reality that the battlefield of 1944 was no longer that of 1940. For the Allies, the situation was precarious. American forces under General Omar Bradley were spread thin, exhausted from weeks of bitter fighting through Bocage country. Their tanks, Shermans mostly, were numerous but vulnerable when caught in the open. Infantry divisions were still adapting to the brutal tempo of combat in Normandy. Morale was steady, but the possibility of a German breakthrough loomed like a storm on the horizon. The memory of the Ardennes in 1940, when France had been torn apart by German armor, haunted Allied planners. If the panzers broke through here, the invasion itself could unravel. The stakes could not have been higher. Yet there was a critical difference between 1940 and 1944. The skies. In the earlier years of the war, German panzers had rolled with near impunity, their armored spearheads protected by the mighty Luftwaffe. Stukas screamed overhead, their sirens striking terror into defenders. But in 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Its pilots were overworked, its aircraft outnumbered, its fuel reserves dwindling. Above Normandy, the balance of power in the air had shifted decisively. American and British fighters patrolled relentlessly, hunting down any German plane bold enough to rise. And among these Allied fighters, one aircraft was redefining the battlefield in ways German generals had never anticipated. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Introduced as a high-altitude escort fighter, it had first been underestimated, even by its own pilots. Heavy, massive, weighing nearly 8 tons fully loaded, It lacked the elegant lines of the Spitfire or the nimble agility of the Mustang. German pilots mocked it as a flying bathtub, ungainly and slow. But the Thunderbolt had something they did not account for: versatility. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine gave it immense power. Its rugged frame could absorb staggering punishment. And most importantly, its 8 heavy 50-caliber Browning machine guns could shred anything on land or in the air. What began as a plane meant to duel high-altitude bombers was reborn as a low-level predator, a flying tank killer, an armored angel of destruction. By the time of Mortain, the Americans had embraced this role fully. The Thunderbolt became the spear of tactical air power, a concept that married aircraft directly to the needs of ground commanders. No longer were planes separate, pursuing strategic bombing campaigns far from the front. Now they were eyes, ears, and fists, coordinated by radio from forward observers, embedded with infantry. A platoon under fire could call in support, and within minutes a flight of P-47s would scream overhead, diving with lethal accuracy. German generals had prepared their counterattack, expecting to duel Shermans and GIs. Instead, they found themselves facing a new invisible weapon, a seamless network of men on the ground and machines in the sky working as one. The mismatch was profound. German doctrine still imagined armored thrusts as near invincible, provided they were fast and decisive. In North Africa, in Russia, even in Italy, armor had often dictated the course of campaigns. But the skies over France in 1944 transformed that equation. The Thunderbolt was not merely an aircraft. It was a wall, an unseen ambush, a constant presence that turned roads into kill zones and convoys into funeral processions. Tanks could not outmaneuver it. Columns could not hide. Even camouflage, the German art of deception, faltered under the relentless eyes of Allied reconnaissance and the sheer volume of aircraft overhead. The Wehrmacht was fighting not only the Americans and British, but the very concept of modern warfare itself. Integrated arms where planes, tanks, and radios created a battlefield too complex for blitzkrieg to function. And still the Germans believed. Their arrogance, born of early victories, blinded them to the scale of what they faced. To Hitler, the P-47 was irrelevant, just another tool of an enemy too soft, too industrial, too unimaginative to match the fighting spirit of German soldiers. But to his commanders on the ground, the truth was becoming harder to deny. Reports from the front spoke of entire armored battalions halted, not by artillery or minefields, but by waves of thunderbolts striking with unrelenting fury. Soldiers huddled in foxholes swore they could feel the ground shake with each strafing run, each bomb detonation. Survivors described the psychological terror, the knowledge that death could come from above at any moment, delivered by a plane that seemed impossible to bring down. By August, the Germans' failure to account for this new reality would prove fatal. Operation Lüttich was doomed not by lack of courage, not by faulty tanks, but by the mismatch between old strategy and new technology. The Thunderbolt was the embodiment of Allied industrial might turned into tactical dominance. For every tank Germany could field, the Allies could send a dozen planes to destroy it. For every offensive launched, the P-47 ensured the cost would be unbearable. This was no longer the blitzkrieg of 1940. This was a different war, and the Germans were playing by rules that no longer applied. The context of Mortain, then, was not simply another clash of armor and infantry. It was a demonstration of transformation, of how war itself had changed within just a few years. It was the twilight of German doctrine, meeting the dawn of Allied air-ground coordination. In this crucible, the P-47 Thunderbolt would prove itself not as a clumsy relic, not as a laughingstock, but as a weapon of destiny. A weapon that mocked the mockers, burned through their armor, and carved its name into the very soil of Normandy. In the early months of 1944, when the Allies first unleashed their full air arsenal over Europe, German officers scoffed at the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was big. It was heavy. It was ungainly. Luftwaffe aces joked that it looked more like a farm tractor with wings than a fighter plane. In the war rooms of Berlin, generals placed their faith not in ridicule but in cold calculation. Their panzers were the backbone of the Wehrmacht, their armor divisions the very instrument of blitzkrieg. They had crushed France with them in 1940, nearly broken Russia in 1941, and held off Allied advances across Italy. To these men, tanks were gods of the battlefield. Aircraft could harass, yes, but not halt. The very notion that a flying milk jug could cripple their armored spearheads seemed absurd. And yet, the secret advantage of the Thunderbolt was not visible at first glance. It was not its size, nor its bulk, nor even its armament that doomed the panzer divisions. The advantage was hidden, woven into doctrine, engineering, and industrial might. At its heart was a simple yet devastating truth. The Thunderbolt was not just a plane. It was a system, a machine bound to men on the ground by invisible cords of radio waves, backed by an ocean of production capacity, and designed to deliver destruction in ways no German planner could match. Consider the heart of the P-47, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. 18 cylinders, air-cooled, pumping out over 2,000 horsepower. Its roar was unlike any other, a deep, thunderous growl that shook windows miles away. This was the hidden edge, a power plant that made the Thunderbolt fast enough to dive like a hawk, tough enough to climb back to altitude, and durable enough to return home riddled with holes that would have destroyed a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. German generals mocked its bulk, but that bulk was armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, thick plating around the cockpit, redundancy in its systems, all combined to create a plane that could absorb flak and machine gun fire and keep flying. Where German aircraft bled out from a single hit, the Thunderbolt shrugged off punishment and returned to the fight. But brute strength was only the beginning. The true terror lay in how the P-47 was used. American doctrine had shifted dramatically. Where the Luftwaffe had once pioneered close air support with dive-bombing Stukas, the Americans now surpassed them with scale and sophistication. Thunderbolts were not lone hunters. They were coordinated, tied to forward observers and ground units by robust, crystal-clear radios. A German column spotted moving down a road might believe it had an hour before artillery found its range. With the Thunderbolt, that hour shrank to minutes. An infantry officer, crouched in a hedgerow with a radio, could summon air support almost instantly. Within moments, the growl of R-2800s announced doom from the skies. The Germans were not just fighting tanks and rifles, they were fighting a network, a chain of steel and air bound together by communication the Wehrmacht could not disrupt. German tank crews quickly learned that the battlefield had changed. A Panther might boast sloped armor impervious to most ground fire, but its top deck was vulnerable. The P-47's 8 Browning M2 machine guns spat a storm of 50 caliber rounds, more than 100 per second, that chewed through soft targets and raked the thin armor on turrets and engine decks. Rockets added a new dimension, high-velocity 5-inch projectiles that screamed into convoys with terrifying precision. And bombs, 500 pounds of American industry packed into steel casings, turned roads and crossroads into craters of fire. The advantage was layered: guns for suppression, rockets for accuracy, bombs for annihilation. No panzer commander could prepare for all three. At first, German officers dismissed reports. Surely their men were exaggerating. Surely this jug was no serious threat. But field intelligence painted a grim picture. Columns annihilated without warning. Supply lines shredded before reaching the front. Armored thrusts faltering, not from enemy tanks but from relentless aerial strikes. Prisoners spoke of their terror, describing the sound of approaching thunderbolts as the drumbeat of their own funeral. One Wehrmacht soldier later recalled, "We feared the Thunderbolt more than we feared the Sherman." This was no idle boast. It was the acknowledgement of a truth that gnawed at German confidence. Their most powerful weapon, the tank, was no longer the apex predator of the battlefield. The hidden advantage extended beyond combat. It was in the numbers. The United States could build planes faster than Germany could destroy them. Factories in Detroit, New York, and Connecticut ran day and night, producing P-47s by the thousands. By war's end, more than 15,000 Thunderbolts rolled off the assembly lines. For every plane lost, another replaced it, often improved with incremental upgrades. German industry, bombed relentlessly, could not match this tempo. Each downed Thunderbolt was a temporary victory for the Wehrmacht, but the swarm never abated. There were always more, and more, and more. Even the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could not stem the tide. Fuel shortages grounded many squadrons. Pilot training collapsed into crash courses, sending green recruits against veteran Allied aviators. Where once German generals trusted the sky to their eagles, they now looked upward with dread. The Thunderbolt ruled the air not through elegance, but through attrition, resilience, and an unyielding presence. This advantage was invisible to those who mocked the plane's form. German generals, steeped in doctrines of decisive ground thrusts, could not grasp that the battlefield itself had tilted. War was no longer decided solely by the clash of armor and infantry. It was decided by who could connect ground to sky, who could bring overwhelming power down upon a single road, a single ridge, a single column, at the exact moment it mattered most. The Thunderbolt embodied this shift. It was not a duelist's blade. It was a sledgehammer, wielded with precision by a nation that understood the industrial and tactical demands of modern war. Thus what the Germans mocked became what they feared. The hidden advantage of the P-47 was not its shape or its speed, but its integration into a new kind of warfare. Radios guiding strikes, engines that could endure, weapons that shredded steel, factories that never slept, a machine that was never alone, always backed by the endless tide of Allied resources. This was the secret the generals failed to see. By the time they realized, it was too late. Their columns were already burning, their armor already twisted in fields they once thought secure. The milk jug had become the hammer of judgment. It began with the engine, for in war machines the heart dictates destiny. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a radial powerhouse of 18 cylinders, air-cooled and brutally reliable, throbbed at the center of every Thunderbolt. It produced 2,000 horsepower, a figure that dwarfed many contemporary engines, and it did so with a consistency that battlefield commanders came to trust like clockwork. German engineers had brilliance, but brilliance constrained by scarcity. The Daimler-Benz DB605 that powered the Messerschmitt Bf109 was sleek and efficient, but it demanded precision machining, maintenance, and constant care. The R2800, by contrast, was a brute designed for endurance. Even when riddled with shrapnel, leaking oil, or missing cylinders, the Thunderbolt's heart often refused to die. Pilots returned home in machines that looked more civ than aircraft, living proof that the Jug was as indestructible as its name suggested. Its armor was not an afterthought, it was deliberate. Engineers at Republic Aviation wrapped the cockpit in steel plating. Beneath the skin, self-sealing fuel tanks turned what might have been a fireball into survivable damage. The sheer size of the airframe, mocked as clumsy, granted survivability that no German fighter could match. The Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf 190 was a predator, but fragile. A Thunderbolt could take a direct hit from a 20mm cannon and keep flying. Flak batteries that once counted on shredding Allied fighters watched in horror as Jugs absorbed their salvos, only to bank, circle, and return for vengeance. Pilots trusted their machines because they knew their machines could take punishment beyond reason. Armament was its calling card. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, gave the P-47 unprecedented firepower for a single-engine fighter. Each gun spat 750 rounds per minute. Collectively, the Jug hurled more than 100 rounds every second, a torrent of lead that shredded infantry formations, tore through trucks, and riddled the thinner armor of half-tracks and panzer topside decks. For air combat, it meant that even a fleeting burst could dismember an enemy fighter. For ground attack, it transformed roads and fields into death traps. When combined with high-velocity aircraft rockets, the 5-inch Holy Moses, and 500-pound bombs slung beneath its wings, the Thunderbolt was not a fighter at all, but a flying artillery piece. Tank crews who once feared anti-tank guns or minefields now learned to fear the shriek of rockets from above. Its weight, once a source of derision, became its greatest weapon in attack runs. When a Thunderbolt dove, it dove with mass. Terminal velocity turned the Jug into a sledgehammer. Pilots reported their aircraft shaking violently, but still holding together, as they unleashed ordnance in near-vertical attacks. German gunners often could not traverse fast enough to follow the dive. Survivors spoke of Thunderbolts appearing suddenly, dropping from the clouds like thunderbolts from Zeus himself, delivering death with terrifying finality. Communications bound the machine into a greater web. The SCR 522 VHF radio gave P-47 pilots crystal-clear connectivity with ground controllers and each other. By contrast, many German units still relied on short-range, interference-prone sets, or worse, signal flares and runners. This disparity was decisive. An American forward observer, crouched behind a hedgerow, could call out coordinates, and within minutes the sky would answer with a roar. The speed at which ground and air synchronized crushed German doctrine. Panzers, once confident in their ability to exploit gaps, found themselves ambushed not by enemy tanks, but by invisible networks directing steel rain from above. Production numbers tell their own story. By the end of the war, the United States had built 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts. Factories in Farmingdale, Long Island, and Evansville, Indiana, turned out aircraft with industrial rhythm, while Detroit and Pittsburgh fed them engines, guns, and radios. The Germans, stretched thin, could not match it. The entire run of the Panther tank, a war machine designed to dominate Allied armor, amounted to fewer than 6,000. Every Thunderbolt could hunt tanks, while every Panther could only pray to avoid the sky. Numbers became destiny, and destiny spelled annihilation for German armor columns. Even maintenance spoke to hidden genius. The Jug's radial engine required less delicate handling than liquid-cooled German designs. Mechanics in muddy French fields could swap parts and keep squadrons flying, while Luftwaffe ground crews struggled with shortages and precision demands. The Allies had built not just an aircraft, but a machine designed to thrive in the chaos of modern war. Every detail, from interchangeable components to rugged landing gear that could endure rough strips, spoke of a philosophy: simplicity, durability, volume. Its range, too, was deceptive. With external fuel tanks, the P-47 stretched its wings across France, Belgium, and deep into Germany. Once considered a short-range defender, it evolved into a deep-strike menace, escorting bombers one day and strafing convoys the next. German generals watched supply depots burn, rail lines splinter, and reinforcements scatter, all under the wings of a plane they had dismissed. Technology alone, however, does not win wars. It was the marriage of this technology to doctrine that transformed the Thunderbolt into legend. American commanders recognized its brute strength, its firepower, and its ability to withstand punishment, and they rewrote the playbook of air support around it. Squadrons flew in rotations, ensuring the battlefield was never quiet. Roads became killing fields not because of one pass, but because of waves, morning, noon, and dusk. Survivors of one strike often fell to the next. The Jug's technical gifts became a relentless drumbeat of pressure that no German counteroffensive could outlast. German reports captured the despair. Panzer crews wrote of feeling hunted animals, stalked by predators they could not escape. Officers lamented the inability of flak to deter the Jugs, noting with bitterness that they come always as if endless. Even Luftwaffe pilots, when forced into combat with the Thunderbolt, discovered its strengths. Though less agile in a turn, the Jug dove faster than anything in the sky. To chase it down was to risk self-destruction, as the P-47 plummeted with gravity as its ally, pulling out only when the Earth itself seemed inevitable. Thus, the technical miracle of the Thunderbolt was not beauty but brutality. Every rivet, every pound of steel, every cylinder of its massive engine spoke to a singular purpose: survival and destruction. The Germans had built elegant predators. The Americans had built a blunt instrument of industrialized war. In the cauldron of Normandy, it was bluntness that triumphed. By the time German generals stopped mocking the Jug, it was too late. The technical specifications they dismissed as ungainly had already sealed their fate. The Thunderbolt was a machine built not for duels, but for slaughter. And slaughter it delivered with cold efficiency until the roads of France and Germany alike bore the scars of its wrath. September 19, 1944. The rolling hills of Lorraine lay draped in morning mist, concealing the quiet movement of armored beasts below. The German army, still reeling from the collapse at Falaise, prepared to strike again. 40 miles east of Nancy, at the small town of Aricourt, the 11th Panzer Division gathered its strength. Panthers and Panzer Fools rumbled into formation, their commanders determined to stem the American advance. To the east, the Soviets pressed relentlessly. To the west, the Americans were breaking through into France. The Germans needed a victory here, a show of steel to remind the world that their armor still commanded fear. At dawn, engines growled as the panzers rolled forward. Dust rose from the fields, their black crosses flashing in the dim light. Yet unseen above the mist, engines of another kind stirred. The 362nd Fighter Group, flying Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, had been vectored to the area. Forward observers, embedded with Patton's Third Army, had called in urgent reports. German armor massing, columns forming. The order was clear: destroy them before they reached the American lines. The first Thunderbolts appeared as shadows against the rising sun. Their wings dipped, their engines thundered, and then they descended. The sky erupted in fury. 50-caliber guns spat death into the fields, tearing across the columns. Rockets streaked downward, leaving trails of smoke, striking tanks with shattering force. A Panther erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a violent chain reaction that sent its turret skyward like a lid torn from a pot. Panic spread. German crews scrambled to angle their turrets upward to spray fire into the sky. But their rounds passed uselessly as the jugs pulled out of their dives and circled back for another run. The battlefield at Aracourt became a cauldron. Each German thrust forward was met not by American Shermans but by the scream of aircraft diving from the heavens. Tanks that survived the first strikes were soon crippled by follow-up attacks, their tracks blasted, their mobility gone. Half-tracks burned where they stood, infantry scattering into ditches only to be cut down by strafing fire. The American ground forces watched in awe. What might have been a desperate defensive battle turned into a spectacle of annihilation as the P-47s dismantled an armored division piece by piece. German reports later revealed the shock. Commanders complained bitterly that every movement by day was suicidal. The Luftwaffe, drained and absent, could not contest the skies. The once proud Panzerwaffe, designed for lightning advances, was reduced to hiding under camouflage nets, creeping by night, and praying for clouds. At Aracourt, those prayers went unanswered. The weather cleared, and the Thunderbolts returned with merciless persistence. Losses mounted. By September 29th, after 10 days of combat, the Germans had committed over 200 tanks and assault guns to the fight. More than half never returned. Many were destroyed not by tank duels, but by the relentless rain of bombs and rockets. American ground forces reported kill ratios unthinkable just a year before. Shermans advancing against crippled Panthers, infantry moving forward under the protective roar of friendly aircraft. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors described the sound of approaching jugs as a terror unlike artillery or small arms. "It was the sound of inevitability," one captured German officer admitted. "Once they found us, there was nothing we could do." Tank crews fought with fatalism, knowing each mile gained would likely end in fire from above. German doctrine, once reliant on the element of surprise and the spear point of concentrated armor, now collapsed against an enemy who could see and strike at will. American troops, meanwhile, came to revere the Thunderbolt. Infantry pinned down by machine gun nests cheered as rockets obliterated enemy positions. Tankers, outgunned by Panthers, took heart knowing that the skies belonged to their allies. Letters home spoke of the Jug as a guardian angel, a constant presence that turned despair into hope. "When the Jugs came, we knew we were saved," one GI wrote after Aracourt. The battlefield itself bore witness. Fields once green were blackened with smoldering wreckage. Panthers sat twisted and silent, their steel carcasses still smoking. Craters pockmarked the roads. Shattered vehicles littered the countryside. The smell of burning fuel and scorched earth hung heavy in the air. For the Germans, the battlefield was a graveyard. For the Americans, it was proof that the future of war had shifted. What made Aracourt decisive was not only the number of tanks destroyed, but the message it sent. German generals could no longer rely on armored thrusts to dictate battle. Even when they gathered their best, experienced crews, advanced Panthers, they found themselves helpless before the coordinated fury of air and ground power. The Thunderbolt had rewritten the rules, and the lesson extended beyond Lorraine. Throughout France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, the story repeated. At Mortagne, at Falaise, at countless villages and crossroads, German armor columns met the same fate: discovery, harassment, destruction. The Luftwaffe's absence amplified the effect, leaving the Wehrmacht naked beneath the relentless hammering of Allied air power. Each time a column burned, the myth of the Panzer's invincibility burned with it. By the end of September 1944, the 11th Panzer Division was shattered. Its men fought bravely, but courage could not protect steel from fire falling out of the sky. Reports filtered back to Berlin, where generals who once mocked the Thunderbolt now seethed in frustration. Their armies were being bled not by grand offensives or superior tanks, but by a machine they had dismissed as irrelevant. The flying milk jug had become the executioner of their armored dreams. Arakourt was more than a battle. It was a turning point in perception. Soldiers on both sides saw the truth. The battlefield was no longer the domain of armor alone. The skies had become the true high ground, and the nation that controlled them controlled the war. For the United States, the P-47 Thunderbolt was the embodiment of that truth. For Germany, it was a nightmare that refused to end. The battles of Mortain and Arakourt were not just tactical defeats for the Wehrmacht. They were tremors of a larger collapse, a revelation that the battlefield itself had shifted beneath German boots. For years, the armored fist of the panzer divisions had dictated tempo and terror. But by 1944, the very thing that once gave them dominance, the concentration of steel, speed, and surprise, had become a liability under skies ruled by the Thunderbolt. What the Germans had mocked as a clumsy jug was reshaping the very psychology of modern war. On the strategic level, the effect was immediate. German planners had once relied on their ability to move by day, to concentrate forces quickly, to surge through weak points. This doctrine demanded visibility, momentum, and daylight. But under Allied air supremacy, daylight became deadly. Tanks that rolled at noon were coffins by dusk. Supply convoys that ventured down roads under the sun were reduced to smoking wreckage by evening. Entire divisions were forced into nocturnal habits, creeping forward under the cover of night, camouflaging by dawn, and lying still through the day like hunted animals. The Wehrmacht, once famed for rapid maneuvers, was reduced to hesitation and delay. Every movement carried the risk of annihilation from above. This paralysis fractured German strategy. Hitler still demanded offensives, still barked orders for armored thrusts, but his generals knew the truth. Speed had become suicide. Reports from the front described air attacks as constant, relentless, unavoidable. "We could not move without being struck," one officer confessed. The result was a creeping exhaustion. Commanders hesitated to commit armor, knowing that concentration would only invite destruction. Supply lines broke down under repeated strikes, starving frontline units of fuel and ammunition. The juggernaut of blitzkrieg had become a rusting machine, choking on the fumes of its own doctrine. For the men on the ground, the psychological toll was even greater. Tank crews lived with a gnawing dread, a sense that their steel fortresses had turned into traps. The clank of treads and the rumble of engines no longer inspired confidence, it invited attention. Survivors spoke of the unnatural silence before a strike, the sudden roar of engines, the shriek of rockets, the hammer of machine gun fire that shook their turrets like fists on a coffin lid. A single pass from a flight of P-47s could erase hours of preparation, leaving only fire and twisted wreckage. Men who had once mocked the milk jug began to whisper of it as if it were an executioner, faceless, tireless, inescapable. This fear rippled outward. Infantry marched in dread of open ground. Supply drivers prayed with each mile that no observer had spotted them. Officers lamented the futility of maneuvering when the enemy seemed omniscient. In diaries and letters, German soldiers described the psychological weight of fighting not just men, but machines beyond reach. "It was like the hand of God striking from the sky," one private wrote bitterly. The Thunderbolt had become not only a weapon of destruction, but of despair. On the American side, the impact was the inverse. For infantry slogging through hedgerows and towns, the jug was salvation. Pinned by machine guns, they could call for air support and watch as the very earth split apart under the strike of bombs. Outgunned Shermans found courage, knowing that rockets from above could even the odds against Panthers and Tigers. Letters home were filled with reverence. "When the jugs showed up, we cheered," one GI recalled. "We knew we had a chance." The Thunderbolt was not just a plane, it was a promise that they were not abandoned, that the might of American industry and ingenuity soared above them, ready to intervene at the moment of greatest need. Strategically, the Thunderbolt carved out a new kind of battlefield. No longer could armor be seen as a war winner on its own. Mobility, once the Wehrmacht's sharpest blade, dulled against the constant hammer of air interdiction. Allied forces advanced not only because of their numbers, but because the P-47 stripped the Germans of their ability to concentrate resistance. Every attempt to mass for a counterattack risked obliteration. The result was fragmentation. German units fought in isolation, unable to synchronize, unable to muster decisive blows. Even beyond the front, the ripple was felt. Bridges collapsed under bombing runs. Rail yards smoldered. Trucks burned before reaching the line. This disruption was not merely physical, it was psychological. German soldiers began to doubt not only their equipment, but their entire command structure. Orders seemed disconnected from reality. Commanders demanded attacks that men on the ground knew were impossible under skies dominated by Allied planes. Morale frayed. Desertions increased. The iron discipline of the Wehrmacht, forged in years of victory, began to crack. The psychological war was as decisive as the physical one. American pilots, often returning to base with their jugs riddled with holes, spoke of the sight of enemy soldiers abandoning vehicles, scattering in terror before a single shot was fired. They knew what was coming, one pilot said. Sometimes just the sound of our engines was enough. Fear itself became a weapon, multiplying the Thunderbolt's effectiveness beyond bombs and bullets. For German generals, the humiliation cut deep. They had spent years perfecting armored warfare, only to watch it undone not by superior tanks, but by a plane they had ridiculed. Their soldiers, once invincible in the Blitz, were now cornered and helpless, their steel beasts reduced to prey. In after-action reports, bitter officers admitted the futility. Our panzers were destroyed before they could fight, one wrote. The psychological blow extended to the highest levels of command. Hitler's rants grew more desperate, detached from reality. He demanded counterattacks with forces that no longer existed, blind to the fact that his enemies had found a way to strike not just at his armies, but at the very soul of his strategy. The P-47 had done more than win battles. It had unmade the German way of war. It replaced speed with paralysis, confidence with dread, momentum with attrition. It turned the Wehrmacht from predator into prey, and in doing so, it shaped the campaigns of 1944 and 1945, ensuring that every German counterattack collapsed before it began. The laughter that once greeted the flying jug had given way to silence. A silence filled only with the sound of engines overhead, the sound of inevitability. When the smoke cleared over Europe in 1945, the wreckage told its own story. Fields from Normandy to the Rhineland were littered with the charred hulks of German armor. Roads once designed for blitzkrieg were pitted with bomb craters, flanked by burned-out convoys that would never reach the front. And looming over these graveyards of steel was the unmistakable legacy of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. What had begun as an object of ridicule, mocked by German generals as too heavy, too clumsy, too slow, had emerged as one of the decisive instruments of Allied victory. Its contribution was not measured only in tanks destroyed or trains derailed, but in the way it rewrote the very nature of modern war. The lesson was brutal in its clarity. German tanks were technological marvels, Panthers with their sloped armor, Tigers with their massive guns, both capable of crushing Allied armor in open combat. But these machines fought on the ground. Their strength was bound to roads, fuel depots, and railheads. The Thunderbolt severed those lifelines. It turned highways into killing zones, fuel convoys into funeral pyres, and armored spearheads into smoldering wreckage before they ever reached the battlefield. The Germans had built weapons for duels of steel against steel. The Americans had built a system where the duel itself could be prevented, the opponent crippled long before contact. That was the true victory of the Thunderbolt, not merely killing tanks but invalidating their very purpose. The psychological legacy endured long after the war. Veterans of the Wehrmacht admitted their dread of the P-47. In post-war interviews, tank crews described how the distinctive roar of its R-2800 engine froze blood in their veins. Even when the jug carried no bombs, its presence alone scattered columns, delayed movements, forced German divisions into night marches that exhausted men and machines alike. The laughter that once greeted its ungainly silhouette had been replaced by haunted memory. As one German officer confessed bitterly, "We did not fear your Shermans. We feared your Thunderbolts." For the Allies, the lesson was triumphant but sobering. The P-47 demonstrated the overwhelming power of integration. Aircraft tied directly to ground forces, radios linking the sky to the mud, and factories feeding the front with an endless tide of machines. Soldiers in foxholes remembered the jug not as an abstract piece of engineering, but as a savior. Letters home spoke of our angels in the sky, of moments when defeat seemed certain, until the roar of engines turned despair into hope. The bond between ground troops and pilots was forged in fire. each strike a reminder that American ingenuity and industrial might stood beside them, overhead, ready to intervene. Strategically, the Thunderbolt's legacy stretched far beyond 1945. The United States had discovered a truth that would shape the Cold War and beyond. Control of the skies meant control of the battlefield. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf War, the doctrine of close air support, perfected by the Jug, remained central. Modern aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt Iseku carried its name and its spirit forward. A plane designed not for elegance, but for destruction, a guardian of ground troops, a terror to armored columns. Every time an American pilot loosed rockets on enemy tanks in later decades, the shadow of the P-47 loomed above, whispering its hard-earned lesson: armor dies beneath the sky. For Germany, the legacy was humiliation, tempered by bitter respect. Their tanks had been formidable, their soldiers disciplined, their engineers brilliant, but the war revealed the limits of tactical excellence in the face of strategic imbalance. Industry integration and adaptation had outmatched precision and arrogance. In post-war memoirs, German generals admitted as much. One even remarked, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that fought together." The same could be said of the skies. Germany built elegant fighters, but America built planes that fought with armies. They'd fought as part of a system that multiplied force beyond measure. The P-47 was not flawless. It was not the fastest, nor the sleekest, nor the most agile. But it was indomitable. It absorbed punishment, delivered devastation, and returned again and again until the enemy broke. In its rugged frame, in its massive engine, in its 8 thundering guns, it embodied the American way of war: relentless, industrial, overwhelming. Its silhouette may have been mocked, but in the crucible of Normandy, Lorraine, and the Ardennes, it became a symbol of inevitability. And so its legacy endures, not only in museums and history books, but in the doctrine of every modern military. Wars are no longer decided solely by the clash of armies on the ground. They are decided by the integration of all arms, by the ability to see, strike, and adapt faster than the enemy. The P-47 was one of the first great heralds of this truth. It proved that speed alone does not win, nor armor, nor even bravery, but connection. Connection between men, between machines, between sky and earth. As the war ended, thunderbolts roared one last time over the ruins of Germany. They had come as jokes, as curiosities, as machines their enemies did not fear. They left as legends. In the silence that followed, as Europe rebuilt from ashes, the lesson was written in fire and steel. In modern war, firepower is nothing without coordination, armor is nothing without protection, and no weapon can stand alone. The P-47 Thunderbolt had shown the world that victory belongs not to the strongest tank, nor the fastest fighter, but to the force that binds them all together. The laughter of German generals had long since died, buried beneath wreckage and smoke. What remained was the echo of engines, the thunder of guns, the memory of a plane that was never meant to be elegant, but was destined to be decisive. A plane that mocked the mockers, that shattered armored columns, that carved its place in history not with beauty, but with brutality. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug, the hammer of the skies, and the enduring truth it left behind. In war, connection outweighs firepower, and thunder always follows lightning.